So thank you everyone again for coming along to our webinar today. My name's Katie. I'm from Boomerang Labs and I'll be moderating today's session. We run a monthly webinar series and this is our nighttime edition as we have some great speakers coming from outside of the normal Australian time zones. So before we get into it, we'd like to give a short spiel on Boomerang Labs so you can remember who we are and why we're the ones moderating this in the first place. Boomerang Labs was established as Australia's first circular economy accelerator, primarily working with startups and innovators, but more and more so being a really big part of conversations with the broader ecosystem and building markets for circular innovation in Australia. A quick promo to next month's webinar, Future-Proofing Supply Chain Circular Strategies for a Volatile World. I'll get Taylor to put the link into the chat for the people who are listening in and interested in joining that one. That's coming up at the end of June, and we will be chatting all things volatility. It's front of mind for a lot of people, material sovereignty and so forth, and flows on quite nicely. Looking at that global scale, like we will be a little bit today. I firstly wanted to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which we all work and live. For me, that's the Wanneroo people of the Hunter region. And we pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging. I'm going to stop sharing screen so that we can see all of our faces and all of our presenters today now. We're very delighted to have three great speakers today from three different areas of the world right now. All three Australians who are working in different areas, essentially in the pursuit of circular innovation adoption. So they all come with quite different perspectives, quite different experiences, and different reasons for moving internationally. So we have three speakers. We have Karen Davids, we have Tim Lee, and we have Max from Higgins from Bear Hug Pallet Wraps. So again, we're going to give each of our speakers a chance to chat about their experience, their European experience, and what's drawn them to other nations. And then we'll get into some Q&A. I've got some questions I'm really keen to ask, but as always, the chat will be open and we're really keen to get the conversation going beyond just the four little faces that you can see right now. So please use the chat, use the hands up function. We want to get this as active as we can. So without further ado, Karen, I'd love to pass to you first.
For sure. Thanks, Caitlin. Good evening, everyone from Australia. It's midday, as you can see with the light booming behind me. But yeah, really exciting to be here because I have worked with some of you in the past in Australia. So I was previously with MRA Consulting Group, which I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with. Really great place to work. And then I jumped ship to Salzburg, Austria, to work for Aldi, or Hofer, as they call it here. And the headquarters is based in Salzburg. So you get kind of a nice mix of the mountains, Austrian life, very traditional, and sustainability. But I will share my screen so you've got something to follow while I walk us through the points today. All right, hopefully, yeah, that looks like it's working. All right, so where I want to start off is really to walk us through why I think the Australian government cannot simply replicate Europe's circular transition. And I think the easiest place to really break this down is if we look at the first two bubbles, we have to understand how Europe and Australia's transition towards circularity differs. So how I'd put it is that, Europe demonstrates really strong circular ambition, but it doesn't automatically translate into effective implementation. And there's a number of examples for that, which I'll walk us through. And then Australia, I think we really risk losing the willingness from industry and consumers to engage in circularity. And that's because we don't have these harmonized requirements that Europe does have under some of its regulation. It's not perfect, but some of it. And so what does this really mean? I would say that both approaches are substantially limited. And I wouldn't want us to put Europe on a pedestal and say it's, this golden child that Australia is going to perfectly mirror. Also, as we'd be aware, we have different geographical dimensions, economic criteria, and so forth, which I'm not going to cover in the scope of this discussion, but it's just something important to keep in mind. And so, yeah, I really tried to summarize here the key distinctions, obviously in a generalized way, given the time, but I think we can simmer it down to Europe tends to move faster and overwhelm industry with complexity. And Australia moves slower and lacks national coordination, which really results in fragmentation and under delivery on what could be a really strong potential in circular innovation and investment. So for me, the key question stands, how do we actually enable an effective circular transition? Um, and I think that requires three core goals that a strong system drives. For me, and I think for a lot of people that work in this space, that could be articulated as one, environmental effectiveness. So, does the regulation actually reduce impact, or are there maladaptive outcomes? And, there are a number of maladaptive outcomes, which I'm happy to shed light on in the Q&A. So please do ask questions. There's a number of fascinating examples. Economic viability. Can businesses realistically comply within, very complex supply chains and given the cost involved? And then three, the goal of political durability. So can the system actually withstand backlash and adapt in a way that supports the viability of circularity rather than working against it or circularity becoming dependent on it, which is something we really don't want happening in Australia. So yeah, I'm going to give a couple of examples that unpack the challenges Europe's faced in striving for these three goals. So I want us to think of this as the framework and what Australia really should take away from these high-level learnings. Probably the most essential place to start is the EU Omnibus package, which I'm sure a number of you have heard about. It was adopted in February last year. And for Europe, this was really a key inflection point because it illustrated just how difficult it is to achieve these three goals. After much political backlash, the EU came forward and they said, we're going to include a set of revisions to ESG regulation, not all of the regulation, but three key legislations, one of them being the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. And why was this the case? Well, effectively, industry argued that the requirements had a few barriers. One, they assumed implementation capacity existed. So that's things like data and reporting systems. Two, the legislations assumed the implementation costs could also be carried by SMEs, which realistically they couldn't in most cases. Three, it underestimated supply chain complexity, especially for businesses that import, like Aldi. And four, and I would really argue this is a super significant one, it risked a loss of trust in the system as infrastructure gaps limited the viability of sustainability, and then circularity as a subsector of that. And if we lose trust in the system, how can we work together in an efficient way to achieve those three goals? It's ultimately stunted. So I think that fourth one is something we need to really critically reflect on. How do we keep building trust rather than go in ambitiously and then diminish trust because of a number of consequences that I'll now unpack. So yeah, the EU's in a bit of a pickle, let's say. I don't think it wants us to use that euphemism, but let's just say that. And I think that despite simplifying some of the major ESG legislations, it's now really seeing this political backlash again, but across other sustainability legislations. I've noted a few in orange here. So we've got the packaging and packaging waste regulation, which is the one that I have particular close touch points on because I work in the PPWR circularity team at Aldi. So effectively, our whole job is to break down the articles in the legislation, extrapolate the key impacts on the business, and work towards compliance. And then you've got, secondly, the eco design for sustainable product regulation, which is something that's also been mentioned at conferences in Australia over the past couple of years. That's not as complex and dense as the PPWR. Effectively, it's a shorter legislation with maybe you could say slightly less detail, but it's all very complicated still. And then you've got the third one. I've said ECGT. That's just the abbreviation for the Empowering Consumers for the Green Transition. So let's start maybe with PPWR, which is at the moment kind of like my best friend, but also my enemy. So there's, as I mentioned, a lot of requirements. It's something like a 200-page document, if I remember correctly. And one of the requirements is restrictions on packaging formats, like some single-use plastics, not all. And what does this mean? Well, essentially, businesses need to investigate material replacements as early as possible But as we all probably recognize, with material replacements, we've got a few key issues. One, they can be just as resource intensive to produce as plastics. They might, or they're very likely going to have limited supply. And because of this, probably cost more. And three, they might actually have poorer recovery outcomes than plastic recycling in a number of member states in the EU. So what we're now seeing here is that some businesses are investigating in things like bio-based plastics, such as PLA, but these actually contaminate recycling pathways or end up in landfill due to limited industrial composting infrastructure in the EU. And that's something that the EU Parliament has also recognized. Like they know there's these infrastructure gaps, but they're still pushing quite ambitious legislation and hoping industry will just kind of catch up, if you will. So the key issue for businesses like Aldi is that they cannot accurately predict whether these infrastructure gaps will actually be filled, which means, we might be investing in these material switches only to find out that the infrastructure won't exist. So that means, where the complexity really typifies how difficult it is to achieve these goals, because at the end of the day, of course, the regulation is focused on environmental effectiveness or like sustainability. But what we're documenting is that there are increased costs because of poorly sequenced requirements. And what does that result in? More political backlash. So you're seeing like this deterioration again of trust in the system, which is ultimately probably one of the worst outcomes if we want to make this like not an idealistic, but a realistic system moving forward. If we want to make circularity something that actually is achievable. Another interesting case study, I would say, falls under the empowering consumers for the green transition. Another legislation that I've had a couple of close touch points on. So under this, all packaging with non-compliant sustainability labels and claims will need to be taken off shelf by September of this year. I'm happy to delve into what that actually means in the Q&A if someone has questions. But effectively, that packaging will either have to be reprinted or destroyed, which in both cases is costly. And so the key issue in this context is that it's difficult for businesses to prepare for this deadline because the ECGT is a directive. It's not a regulation. And that means that each member state has the discretionary power to, implement the requirements as they see fit. And businesses can't preempt how that's going to roll out in a lot of cases. They can make intelligent assumptions based on their understanding of how member states have worked in the past, but it's not guaranteed. And, if we think about now what was the outcome of this ambiguity, well, the transposition into national law only occurred 6 months before the September deadline. So it happened in March, just not that long ago. But the lead time for packaging reprints is 6 up to 12 months. So that's taking longer than the actual confirmed requirements. And that means that even well-intentioned businesses will likely have to destroy stock in September because they couldn't reprint in time. I'm simplifying to some extent, but I think that's a high level consequence that is important to just like comprehend and see that like timelines are so crucial to get us in a state of, again, trust and like a durable circular system. So I guess moving forward, what all these examples, unveil is that regulators often fail to sufficiently address implementation capacity prior to the requirements. And if we want to make circularity effective, I think regulators need to come in with one, offering technical guidance well before the compliance deadlines. This might look like what we saw with the ECGT, like the exact requirements in each member state earlier rather than later. It can also be things like recyclability methodologies or recycled content thresholds under the PPWR. So businesses actually know how to redesign products intentionally from the start rather than guess how to redesign it. Only for the legislation to come out and be like, actually, there's all these details that you need to now consider that weren't considered in the first redesign because of a lack of clarity. And then they need to make high cost decisions to rectify that. So again, that's a lack of trust in the system because of poorly sequenced rollout. Two, I think the regulators really need to harmonize enforcement more. So businesses aren't required to redesign in each market. And, I think another interesting example under the PPWR for this is that it introduces a recyclability grading system for packaging. So that's effectively where you've got grade A, grade B, grade C, and you've got a different recyclability target for each grade. So it's 70%, then I think it's like 85 or something, and then 90. Um, and within a harmonized grading system, member states can still apply their own fee per grade. Oh, for a company like Aldi, that means if we're selling packaging in Austria and Italy, we might pay vastly different amounts for the same packaging, and that creates conflicting incentives. Um, and the last thing I would argue that the regulators really need to think about is giving a clearer definition of producer responsibility across ESG regulation, because the current ambiguity in the definition is causing a lot of political tension in the EU. And of course, that's challenging goal 3 yet again. Just to put that into context a bit more, I think, some common questions that are being raised by industry at the moment is the supplier the producer? Because they decide on the product and packaging specifications, or is it the brand owner with their name on pack, or is it a shared responsibility because of the complexity of the supply chain? And if so, how is this actually meant to be divided in practice? It's all very blurry, and at the end of the day, it essentially means it's hard to know who's taking responsibility for the exact requirements in the legislation. So I guess moving towards a bit of a summary, because that's a lot of like heavy problems, and how do we move forward? I think, Europe has got some things right. Otherwise, I wouldn't be sitting in this chair and be in Austria from Australia. But if we don't get these major implementation barriers addressed, sustainability is going to become more complex, expensive, and harder to scale. So maybe we'll find ourselves in a worse position than we were in originally. But Australia is still in this kind of exciting stage where we've got a lot of opportunity to shape the system. And yeah, so I think, we need to think of moving forward in 2 stages. One, I would say, let's build infrastructure and systems capability. And as mentioned, like Australia sits in an opportunistic period right now because you can really build something intentionally. Like you can build an intentional circular system which balances these 3 core goals if you think very proactively and positively about this. In more tangible terms, we can say, we need to develop data, traceability, and reporting systems before the regulation comes in. And to achieve this, we can fund more pilots, fund more voluntary standards that reveal the system gaps. And also, for me, really important has always been to advocate for upstream circularity, reuse, refill, repair, redesign, in addition to downstream recycling, which is a tension in Australia for sure. And from all of that, we collect the data and we build cases for effective reform. Ultimately, with the objective in that phase being that, we build the commercial viability of circularity before the introduction of really strict standards that might kind of like close us in. So that brings us to phase 2, which I'd say once the infrastructure is established, and there's still need for support for extra growth, the government should work with industry very closely to introduce harmonized incentives. This is where I would say Europe does sit, but the problem is that they skipped parts of step 1. I'm not saying entirely at all. I think they took a number of good steps, but they did kind of, I think, lose touch with industry in some sectors particularly, and then now they're faced with the issues like the omnibus package. So that means when legislation is introduced, I think it really needs to consider how do we make consistent fees, for example, if that is effective. It depends on the exact legislation actually, but technical guidance also needs to come early on to ensure cost-effective redesigns. And I think also grace periods need to be considered more seriously, because that allows industry to use up non-compliant stock like sustainability labels under the ECGT, even once the new standards are enforced. So yeah, in summary, recognize that's a lot of information to take in, but I think I just want to leave by saying by no means do these 2 phases mean Australia will achieve perfect circularity or achieve those 3 goals. But at least at least we can reflect on, where the weaknesses in the system might show and how we can address these or mitigate them really early on to ensure a smoother transition. So I think this is a huge, huge opportunity for Australia to take a lot of like structural lessons from Europe, and hopefully we can dive into that deeper in the Q&A. So please come, lots of questions, happy to address them. Okay, that's it from me. Thanks, guys. Stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Karen. That was fantastic and set the scene so well. And I think just it's such an important point that Australia does have this chance to leapfrog to some extent, is that Europe is, 10, 15 years ahead is often thrown around as a stat, or a phrase here, but it should not be seen as an excuse or as we're never going to get there, but we're, sitting in a really unique position for um, to speed up and learn from them. So thank you so much for that. It was really informative, and I can see there's some stuff coming through in the chat already. Kim Lee from Utilitarian, we'll hand over to you. I'd love to hear about your experience in the Netherlands and beyond.
Thank you, Katie, and thanks, Karen. It was very, very good. And hi to everyone. There's lots of familiar names and faces, so good to see everybody. I'm going to share my screen. Let's see how we go. Everybody see that? It should look like a web page.
Yep, that's up now.
All right, so I'm starting from here, just so everyone knows that this presentation is available on our website, so you're welcome to go there and have a look through. I will probably keep tweaking with it, because I'm never quite happy with it, but you're all more than welcome to go and take a look. So the approach I want to talk about is, again, I guess, in essence, taking lessons from where Europe is. And to start with, probably setting out what I believe, at least in my opinion, why, especially sitting from an Australian perspective, why Europe seems so attractive. I know when we first started going over there, it felt like it was going to be the land of like rainbows and unicorns for circular economy. As you've heard from Karen, nothing's ever quite as amazing as it seems, but it does have a head start and a lot of lessons for us to learn from. I really focus on the interaction between retailers, brands, and consumers. That's what we do. We want to see more circular activity, and where brands and retailers can really take the lead and help everyday consumers like you and I do take different actions, and that's the focus for our company. So we did make a very conscious decision about 18 months ago now to move from Australia to Europe. We did that for a lot of the reasons why I've already mentioned. It was very clear to us that Australia wasn't ready for what we were doing, for purely nothing more than survivability as a company, to go to Europe, where it's further advanced, it's a bigger market. And I think one of the other big things that stands out, which I haven't put on any of the other slides, is that for a lot of the big retailers and brands, that's where the headquarters are. And so often I find in Australia, a lot of the major multinationals, their representatives here are very limited in what decisions and actions and investments they can make, because they're dictated to by their overseas headquarters. And so sitting in the Netherlands in particular, a lot of the major retailers and brands have their headquarters for Europe, at least, if not global, in Amsterdam. For a whole range of reasons, mainly tax reasons. And so that's why we made a decision to go there, to sort of be on the front lines and be where the action is. So 3 things I wanted to highlight. One is culture. The second is the way that, obviously, the importance of regulations. And as we've heard from Karen, it's not as simple as making a law. There's so much complexity in that. But the other thing about regulation is typically most companies will work to those regulations, and then you'll start to see the intended effect of those regulations play out, and then, progress will plateau. And so thirdly, I think we must reconcile that unless there is a clear financial penalty or opportunity, some form of financial incentive, you will see companies, I guess, resist and go and revert to the most basic option that they have available to them. And so it's not enough to say that things are voluntary. It's not enough for vague guidelines. There has to be some form of financial bite for regulations to take effect. So the first I wanted to focus on is culture. Um, I think it's very clear there is a major cultural difference between Europe and Australia in terms of attitudes towards sustainability and circular economy more broadly. These cultural differences have been baked in over decades and decades. And so, what we've got on the left there is the participation rate for bottles and cans in Germany versus Australia. And, we all know what that looks like here in Australia, extremely popular, very successful over many, many decades. But if you compare it to Germany, there's a very big difference. And again, very similar mechanisms. It's certainly not apples and apples. But where there's a willingness, there is a major difference. And so, you know, Germany has a higher participation rate and people are aware of it. And when you visit Europe and you speak to people about sustainability, the everyday person on the street, there is a greater awareness. There's a higher level of understanding of the details, and people assume that it's part of their social responsibility. In Australia, it's not to say that we're all wasteful. You can see that where there's access and mechanisms, people certainly participate, but it's not quite the same. With that said, if you then look at e-waste, in-store take back for e-waste has been mandated for quite some time, and you can see the rate of participation in Germany in blue is not what it is for bottles. And again, you don't have a financial incentive. So to think that all of the Germans are running around with the cans and bottles and their e-waste and taking it back to every store with big, happy faces and all, holding hands, that's not the case. So there is a reality at play where some form of financial incentive or mechanism needs to be in place if we want to see participation at its highest levels. And again, you can see with batteries, again, B-Cycle, I think, has been amazingly successful for what it's achieved in a few years in Australia, but it still has a long way to go compared to the other types of schemes that are in place. So I think where Australia is we have been able to build fast. We do have some pretty robust voluntary schemes. We have a great, reach with B-Cycle, 95% of people within 15-minute drives. We've had a very robust container deposit scheme for a long time. But what you're starting to see is in Europe, there's just a better awareness. And so you're starting to see some of the regulations come in about, for example, in the Netherlands, they're looking at consumption targets, dropping from 50 to 35 garments, whereas Australia, we know, is one of the higher per capita consumers of clothing. So there's still some very fundamental cultural differences at play. And I think the point I wanted to make is where you're seeing better regulations, it's not happening by chance. It's because they've had these stronger cultural baselines to build upon, which allows the regulations to come in over the top. And so there's a greater preparedness by people to accept those regulations at face value. So again, the point I was making before is people will work to those regulations. So it certainly forces actions. Businesses want to be compliant, but at some point there's a law of diminishing returns, and that those schemes and the regulations start to have a blunted effect, and so more regulations need to come in. So what are we seeing, for example, and I'm just cherry picking different product categories here. You're looking at textiles as an example. France has had an amazing program in place. Their EPR programs and PRO organisations are very robust, very well funded by different fee schemes. But again, you're starting to see them miss targets. So again, where the EU, as Karen outlined, has very ambitious targets, it doesn't mean that all of a sudden 5 years later they're being achieved without some form of friction, resistance, or misalignment with what industry can or is prepared to do. And so you're starting to see in Europe a range of different additional regulations come into play. And again, they're not always perfect, but I think that's the lesson for Australia is, again, we're still really stuck on voluntary participation. And if we think that it's going to be enough for us to be able to make progress, frankly, we're kidding ourselves, because even where we have a strong cultural base in Europe, they still can't do it. They still need tighter regulations. They still need strong financial incentives in order to make progress. And so if there's one lesson that Australia needs to learn, it's to take that lesson and apply it, and stop, playing games on the edges. So this is sort of how I've summarised some of these things. You're starting to see eco-modulation, and it's important to understand the difference between eco-contributions, fees and schemes, and eco-modulation, where you're really looking at the design of products, and how companies can be either penalised or incentivised to compete on the design of those products as they're put into the market. The point I wanted to make is the fix, which is what Europe is starting to learn as well, is there's still, over and above regulation itself, there does need to be some level of financial incentive or program in place for consumers to step up. And so what we refer to it is an activation and data layer. And I think I could talk about this for hours and hours. Karen did mention the importance of the ability to data gather at different points along the value chain, to use that data to drive behaviour changes, but also to inform policy. There are still big gaps in data. I'm very biased in saying that because we like to try and provide that data and gather that data. But it's also why we created the business and put it into the market in the first place, because we saw that gap exists, and we believe strongly that we need to keep working on that for a better system overall. And then finally, I've made this point, so I won't keep making it. Having toothless schemes and voluntary schemes, skip that and just go straight ahead to making things mandatory. So again, to I guess try and summarize, Europe is very top down. And again, Karen spent a lot of time on this, so I won't go over it. There is a huge benefit to that. There's a lot of different schemes in place, which means they can learn things in parallel. I've just started looking at the world of vapes and the different ways that different countries, and this includes the UK for that matter, are regulating vapes and the collection of vapes is fascinating. Germany has a new law coming in on July 1 where the retailers have to pick up most of the tab. And as Karen said, there's differences between retailers and manufacturers and producers and who's responsible. So they just said, right, the retailer will get some support from an eco contribution fee from the brands, but fundamentally they need to pick up the tab. The challenge for that industry is 40% of the vapes in the market are black label and not regulated. So they're not paying any fees at all. And so now the industry is pushing back around, obviously, free rider issues. Australia, on the other hand, I think is in a prime position, but without being cynical, sometimes can't get out of its own way. You've got a single continent with a single federal government that could sit in over the top and mandate these things. Typically, we see things from a federated perspective, but then we've seen a really positive sign lately, which is New South Wales stepping forward and starting to take the lead in terms of what EPR looks like. So that's me, hopefully in a tight enough timeline. We're in place to do it. There's lots of lessons that we can apply, but we need to get on and take action. So I'll stop sharing and hand over to Max.
Thanks, Tim. Max, take it away.
Perfect. Okay. Can everyone hear me?
Yep.
Great. Cool. So I'll just start off with a bit of context about Bear Hug, what we do, and kind of what led us to Europe in the first place to kind of set the scene. And then I plan on kind of taking us through more of a live example of kind of how we've interfaced with regulation and what it's meant for our business to kind of bring to life those barriers of implementation and sometimes the unintended consequences that arise from poor regulation. And then I'll also go into kind of a great example of a reusable system that's launched recently in Europe, particularly in Germany, and kind of how that came live and what the networks did to kind of support that growth. So the initial context is at Bear Hug, we sell, lease, and supply reusable pallet wrapping as an alternative to single-use plastic stretch wrap. So it's common practice in logistics that every time goods are stacked on a pallet, they're wrapped in 350 grams of soft plastic. So it's a massive problem. And I moved to Germany in October last year, basically because of PVWR. And since getting here, it's been quite a fascinating journey, which I'll get into now. So I'll just share my screen. Okay. Sorry, just bear with me. Cool. So I think that's coming up now. Everyone see that?
We can see you. Oh, yep, it's up now.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. So essentially, what I want to talk about is the impact of regulation and when it gets pulled back. So essentially, what I'll focus on specifically is PPWR's Article 29. And there was quite an interesting arc as to where it was proposed that there would be 100% mandate on reusable pallet wrapping and strapping for certain logistic scenarios. So, for example, the transport of goods between two companies in the same EU member state, but also the transport of goods between any of a company's own sites within a member state or also across member state borders. And so this was initially proposed in December 2024. Now, a first gap that I'll call out early on, and I think Karen touched on this as well, is even though this was stated in 2024, the methodology as well of how this would be calculated, what was in scope, the accountabilities, the penalties, and so on, were not very clear from the outset. So what we saw is 2024 PPWR was adopted. It set this 100% reuse target. But then you see in October 2025, there was a delegated act that was totaled. And a delegated act is basically a revision of PPWR. This went through public feedback between December and January this year. So we got to submit feedback and it was open to the public. So I think over 100 different stakeholders sent in their feedback, and it was one of the most heavily lobbied pieces of legislation in recent history from what we've heard. And then in February 2026, the Delegated Act was adopted, and it actually exempted pallet wrapping and strapping from the 100% reuse mandate and basically relegated it to being kind of a peripheral requirement of within a 40% packaging requirement for transported goods. Now, the biggest impact here is, and Tim touched on this as well, is that when regulation is the key driver for change, what happens when that regulation gets taken away is that all the other beneficial aspects of, for example, reusable pallet wrapping from the cost side, from the sustainability side, from the safety side, have all been completely overshadowed by the regulation, and that as the key driver for change, alongside the fact that PPWR is a massive document. I think Karen said it's over 200 pages. I've only really been concerned with this specific article. So there's just so much of an administrative burden on these companies to determine how they're going to actually become compliant with it. And what we've actually seen is, as a result of very poor regulation writing, is that it actually does have a significant consequence on demand related to all the other benefits of the product. So I think some of the key learnings here is in 2024, when PPWR was adopted and these targets were set, it was definitely poorly researched. There was no real depth of understanding of the solution landscape of how companies were going to switched to reusable pallet wrapping. And then basically what happened was Deloitte was brought in to do a pretty substantial study on the solution landscape after the targets were actually declared. So step one is just be a lot more rigorous in your planning of regulation if you're going to set something up like that. And another downstream consequence when you start giving power to introduce delegated acts is companies will just wait. If they think something seems like it could be overturned, there's no immediate action that will be taken by these companies because they know it's highly likely that things will be reversed. So I think unfortunately for the EU Commission in the sustainability space, it is known for setting ambitious targets, but then also revising them, pulling them back. And I know it's something that's frustrated a lot of stakeholders in different industries on the ground here in Europe. So yeah, I think it's something that's been very close to us and had quite an impact on our business. And I think the unintended consequences of poor regulation often go under-recognized. Now, on a more positive note, I know we're talking about barriers to implementation, but I think it's quite interesting to see what companies have done well and how reuse initiatives have scaled successfully. So a great example is Euro Plant Tray. You can look it up online. They do reusable trays for horticulture and the horticulture industry. And it's a great example because they've only been around for 2-3 years, maybe 4. But the way this project basically came successful was a massive consortium across a multitude of different horticultural companies, facilitated by what's called Stiftung Initiative Mehrweg, which is Germany's leading business-to-business reuse association, and then the Euro Plant Tray initiative itself. So it brought together, I believe at one point it was 50 plus companies to plan a coordinated adoption of reusable trays. And the benefit of this approach is you actually have a plug-in structure. So businesses could choose to opt in, or also if they wanted to and they weren't happy with how it was being built out, opt out instead of having to build up a reusable tray system from scratch within their own company. The second key benefit of this is that the costs were absorbed by the Euro Plant Tray as they went out and they acquired the financing to set up the venture itself. So any operational overhead associated with building the system was actually absorbed by the company leading the consortium. So it really removed a significant barrier of risk and also the financial burden of having to set up a reusable system, but still having the buy-in from 50 plus companies. And then the third is the shared standard. So the association alongside with Euro Plant Tray, they defined basically what was a rule book of specifications for which types of plants could be used within this reusable tray, and just ensuring alignment so that there wouldn't be hiccups along the way in terms of implementing and rolling out this initiative. And since I believe they launched a few years ago, they already have several million trays in production and starting to enter the market. So it's an initiative that really came out of nowhere. And because of how effective the consortium model was for scaling a reuse initiative, this is a really great example of what can happen under the right circumstances. And I think the key takeaway for Australia here is, and I've got this down the bottom, is it's the infrastructure question isn't really necessarily around the systems and the sorting technology, as obviously it is still needed, and Europe is really far more advanced in terms of the systems to enable reusable assets to be used across repairing, cleaning, transport, and so on. But it's also whether the institutional architecture exists or can actually be developed to build similar consortiums to adopt reuse at scale in whichever projects are actually suitable. So I think just to summarize there's a lot of unintended consequences that arise from poorly written legislation and regulation around packaging and sustainability. And kind of the last thing you want from a public perspective is mistrust and a reputation that the regulation itself is ambitious, but it will be clawed back. Cool. I might leave it there.
Great. Thank you so much, Max. And I can't imagine the drop in your heart when you heard about the change in legislation when you just moved from Australia to the other side of the world. So I imagine that that was quite the spanner in the works, but I'm glad that you're seeing some positive um, come out of it nonetheless. I think if
Yeah,
Max, you want to take your screen down, then we can just have our faces there. Thank you very much. There
sure.
we go. Um, inviting everyone to put some questions into the chat. We've already got one or two in there, which I'll go to first as I'm cautious of time. But firstly, thank you so much. All very different perspectives, but some pretty consistent themes on where both Australia and the EU is lacking. There is no one solution. This session was not about criticizing Australia solely. This was really about comparing your experiences in different areas. So thank you so much for sharing that. We have a question here from Sharka from Donut Waste, specifically for you, Karen. She said, greetings to Austria. Has Aldi ever looked into reusable packaging solutions? Are any of them viable, at least in some parts of Europe?
Yeah, so it's actually good timing because I think it flows on from Max's presentation really well. Um, In short, yes, Aldi has tested it out. The UK was an example. They had reuse refill pilots. It was about a year ago now, so it was before I entered the business, but I reflected on some of the high-level findings when I came in. Um, and it's popular among consumers, but a key issue was hygiene and staff costs related to cleaning up spills and the whole Aldi model. It's there's a special strategy how it's rolled out to keep it hyper cost effective, and that means tracking how staff are using their time to the nth degree on the floor in stores. And so if you suddenly introduce refill, it kind of goes against their low budget business model. So that was a key tension of why it didn't really work for them. But then the PPWR came in, we had the proposal and then we had the enforcement of a number of the requirements. And that's where the business started to really reconsider, do we want to turn these pilots into something more serious? But as Max mentioned, there was a lot of controversy within the reuse articles, and Article 29 is not the only one. It's like stretches across maybe 5 articles. It's a really messy part of the regulation. And I think very few people properly understand how reuse will work. And one of the elements to it is I believe it's like Article 50 something. Everyone can look it up, but it's essentially saying like refill. So not just reuse, but it's like a similar kind of aspirational upstream target. You shall endeavor for a 10% refill target of your total sales area. Shall endeavor kind of goes to Max's point that like the business aren't going to do anything because they know it's going to cost them more money and it's not being forced at this stage. It's kind of like maybe the rainbows and unicorn concept that Tim was saying. So I think it's this real sticking point because you need the regulation to push businesses to make it cost effective, but you also need to do your due diligence as regulators to understand, as Max said, the solutions landscape, to then propose the right worded regulation to make it cost effective. So hopefully that answers it in a not such a complicated way, but yes and no is the summary.
Great, thank you, Karen. The next one, I might go to Tim first, but then just invite anyone to jump in from there. So we've got a question there from Sarah Fernal here saying, "What effective ways have our panelists done or seen in the EU that industry has done to affect policy and regulation changes?" I'm keen because Tim, I know you're looking to work with so many different businesses and you would be seeing so much, and I've been seeing hints of your case studies online, so we'd love to hear.
Um, it, I'm going to say it's more an observation rather than necessarily. I don't think an industry, if we're seeing to promote or affect policy, typically if an industry is doing it as a collective, it's to pull regulation back, right? So I, I'll rather not dwell on that. What I'm seeing is a more of a massive shift, and it sort of comes back to Sharka's question, if you don't mind me sort of connecting the two. I've seen, especially in consumer goods, a leapfrog from over recycling, especially around textiles and everything like that, to repair. and other things. And I think this is industry leading where the opportunities are, right? Where there's a clear financial incentive for additional margin to be gained by either trading something in or to be repairing it. I'm seeing the industry more broadly really running in that direction, and you're seeing some amazing capability and infrastructure and accessibility being put into place. Um, but I don't know if it's necessarily all of industry. The way I read the question, like getting in a room and going, right, what are we going to do about it? I think it's just they go where the opportunities are and where the regulation's not necessarily pushing them. So it's more like that's where the school of fish is going, more than anything. And I think that's the best answer I can give, where you are seeing some really great outcomes, but it's not necessarily by design. It's more by collective action because they follow the leader. That's a pretty empty answer, but it's the best I've got.
That's okay. I'm as a follow-up question just from me, selfishly. Australia, we always talk about, has a little bit of a fast follower um, culture. We like to be the second. We like to get
Hmm.
someone else to take the risk. How does that compare to your experience in Europe?
Yeah, I think speaking for like again in this space, there are companies like Decathlon, Beaver, um, and others who I would say are very happy and willing to take the lead and put themselves out there. And they're not doing it waiting for the pack to catch up, nor are they taking steps back if the industry doesn't follow them. Um, so I think there is more, I'll call it courage. Obviously, they're considered in terms of what they're doing. But there are companies out there who are saying, this is who we are, this is what we do. They're not afraid to talk about sustainability, circular economy, and go after it, and they're making it work. So I certainly think that then the other companies are falling in line. But I would say it's very, again, I think very different to Australia. You don't necessarily see that level of leadership and proactiveness, but have it at mass with major retailers like Decathlon, who are huge in Europe, who maybe not as big here, but are massive. Like they're bigger than Rebel, but you don't see Rebel with a major repair counter, as an example.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, we've got, I might get to Max. We've got 5 minutes left. Max, do you have any thoughts on that same follow-up question around, I guess, that appetite for risk and innovation? What are you seeing, particularly when you're seeing policy take a backward step on you there? Do you find that many leads were dropping back as well, or what's your experience?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yeah. Oh, great. Okay. My laptop is playing up. Um, it's tough to say. I think it's in a lot of companies' nature that they don't want to be the first. I think what we found with the regulation is being the first was taken out of the conversation in the early stages because it was just, okay, well, we all need to do this. So um, that wasn't really a consideration, but I think it's just inherent in most companies that they want to see a case study of success with someone else before them. So um, yeah, it's funny Tim mentions Decathlon because Decathlon were one of the people most open to reusable wrapping that we spoke to here. So I think it's um, yeah, it is the case that some are willing to take on more risk, but I think fundamentally a lot of companies just want to see it successful somewhere else first.
So can I add one thing?
Mm.
I think it also matters where the major multinational is domiciled. So Decathlon's French.
Yeah.
So French have really advanced laws relative to other EU countries. And so I think it influences the decision making in the head office and then can have ripple effects across Europe. And I think that has a major aspect of it as well.
Karen, do you have anything to add on that one, or just the two guys got to piggyback on your presentation or make nods to yours, but you being the first presenter didn't get to do anything back. Do you have any comments or follow-ups from what was discussed in the other presentation?
Yeah, I think Patagonia is something that comes to mind, when we're talking about decathlon as well. Like Patagonia has this repair element to their business. And I see in the chat someone's asking, what would be some circular economy regulations that would be most practical to implement first. I think like mandatory EPR schemes, you can start co-regulatory, things like APCO, but that's not going to be effective long term in terms of scalability and like rigorous data reporting. So, if we move towards mandatory EPR systems, and I think the textiles case is interesting in Australia at the moment, and it has been for the last couple of years, seeing how that builds up. But like redesign, which is what Patagonia really focuses on, repair, like all that upstream stuff, I think really should be the priority in policy. It's just, again, like being so much more thorough about understanding Australia's market for reuse, repair, all those, interventions before we actually say, just here's the requirement.
Great point, Max. Did you just come off mute, or you're always off mute if you want to throw you under the bus? But I didn't want to cut you off either.
No, that's okay. My mic is playing up, so please ignore that.
No worries. Okay, great. We've got 2 minutes left and a few comments coming through. I just want to acknowledge that we did have a great conversation. Thread there from Kid asking around how Europe is designed for better accessibility for community participation. So if you haven't already, scrolled through there and check out that particular discussion again on the cans and bottle deposit system. A few more questions. I'm trying to choose which one. I'm going to go in order just to be totally fair here. Reva's asked, given Australia's smaller manufacturing base and export-oriented economy, what types of mandatory circular economy regulations would be most practical to implement first? Big question for a minute left, but would love this can be your final take from each of you if you'd like to give your opinion on what those mandatory regulations should be. Tim, you're nodding. You want to jump in?
I'm still shocked, and I had to double check my research before preparing for this. I still don't think we have a mandatory e-waste scheme in this country, to the best of my knowledge. And that's pretty shocking.
Huge one. Thank you. Karen?
Yeah, I'm interested to see how we take APCO's last strategic business report. It was published just late last year, and we turn that into a really robust mandatory scheme that lends itself to some elements of the PPWR in Europe, but is not a complete replica.
Great, thank you. And Max, to wrap it up, any last thoughts?
Yeah, sorry, you'll see my phone come in for the audio. The e-waste one is definitely topical, but I don't want to piggyback off that. I think something that could be interesting is honestly uplifting the existing bottle return scheme in Australia. Like the incentives here in Europe are far more attractive. I think it's 25 cents per bottle if it's plastic or aluminium, which is cents in euros. So that's probably up around 45 cents AUD, and that's actually an incentive to return them. Yeah.
Can I just quickly add to that? When I worked at MRA, Mike Ritchie wrote a number of really insightful articles on exactly that point, like looking at the modeling. So I encourage people to go, not as a promo, but just go on the MRA website, and you'll find, a number of blog posts that shed a lot of detailed light on that. Yeah. Or contact Mike. He's always happy to chat. Yeah.
Great, thank you so much. Well, we've just ticked over to 9:01 p.m. or 1:01 p.m. if I've remembered what time it is for Max and Karen. So thank you everyone for coming along for today's webinar, and sorry to everyone with the questions that we can't get through. There's always a few unanswered ones in these because we have such great guests. So thank you so much again for your time from everyone. Hope you found this insightful. The recording will be shared with you in the next couple of days once Taylor has a chance to process that. And we hope to see you at our other events in the future.